What's up guys, my name is Mike, welcome back to the YouTube channel. Today we're checking out OverSimplified. It's been a while and we're checking out their video on the French Revolution. This is part 1 and part 2 will be up tomorrow. But just before we start, I would just like to really thank and appreciate all of you that have been liking, commenting and subscribing on my video so far. It's meant a lot, you know, and I've really enjoyed kind of reading through your comments and stuff like this. But at the same time, we're nearly at 800 subscribers at the minute, and once I get to 1,000 I have a few more options of things that I can do to hopefully get you guys a bit more involved. So I'd really appreciate that. If you're not subscribed, and if you could subscribe, then it could just helps the channel grow. And if you did really actually like this video, or you have suggestions or feedback or anything like this, then again I ask, please, if you could like or you could comment. It just helps the video kind of get out there, reach more people, and by doing that I can hopefully help the channel grow a little bit more. As the clock's going and really annoying me, I hope you guys enjoy this video, and without further ado, let's go. Yes, so the French Revolution, probably one of the most tumultuous and kind of influential periods in history, I feel like, both not only just for the French Revolution, the shockwaves that it sent around Europe, but practically, you know, the Napoleonic Wars and all the things that came out as a result of them. You know, countries were created out of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. But I don't want to front load this video too much. I do love this period in history, but as always, I will let the video play and then I'll pause it and then kind of add information where I feel it's relevant. Otherwise, back to Oversimplified. Haven't been in there for a little while. I'm trying to remember the last video that I've done of this. So, yeah, looking forward to this. Let's go.
This video was made possible by NordVPN. Get protected by clicking the link below and get an amazing 75% off. That's only $2.99 per month with an additional month free for a limited time. Also, new French Revolution merch available now in the store, including King Louis and Marie Antoinette character pins, complete with detachable heads, just like the real thing.
Oh no.
So I said to the Marquis de la Fufayette, "What do you think I am? Some dirty peasant? I've never worked a day in my life." Wow, that Marie Antoinette sure is pretty. Sure is. Wouldn't want to be Prince Louis though. That's going to be a lot of responsibility when he becomes king, especially since France is in financial ruin. Quite. Thank you one and all for attending the royal marriage of my grandson, the future King of France, to the Archduchess of Austria. Now for the very awkward yet historically accurate part of the ceremony, where we all watch them get into bed together. Alright, now that's out of the way, let's leave the royal couple to it. You better give us an heir, you fat, ill-bred boy. Nighty-night. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. Quite. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. France is in financial ruin. You fat, ill-bred boy. That's gonna be a lot of responsibility. Oh, great. He's a freaking weirdo.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a moment. So obviously, the situation in France at kind of right now is in a line of succession. The quality of kings has really been in decline, not decline. So obviously you had one of the most famous and influential probably kings in France's history with Louis XIV, the Sun King as he was known. You know, he done things like he pacified the aristocracy, had a number of social reforms, as well as kind of brought France into several major conflicts, including the War of Spanish Succession. And Louis XIV really cemented this idea of absolute monarchy within France. So the idea that the king is all powerful, essentially. You know, as opposed to at the similar time, you know, Britain was moving towards like the constitutional monarchy, where the king is more, or the monarchy still has a degree of power, but it's more of a figurehead. It's more, you know, power sharing, parliament, kind of the elected body of the people, that kind of thing is more that. So France has gone the complete opposite direction. And the thing is, though, the problem with that is Louis XIV, as I said, was very competent. So he could pacify the aristocracy, he could practically pacify the entire country and rule that kind of absolute monarchy quite well. However, as time went by, the successive kings weren't very good at it. And by the time we reached Louis XVI, which is the poor old prince freaking out here, the quality of leadership has dropped off quite dramatically. But I also just want to talk a little bit about the bedding ceremonies as well, because it's really weird when you think about it. If you've seen Game of Thrones or things like this, you might also remember before the Red Wedding, at the Twins, Walder Frey carries off Edmund Tully and stuff like that for the bedding ceremony. And that's something that used to happen. And it was almost quite the norm for a newly wedded couple to be carried to the bedchamber, to the bedroom by their friends, family, neighbours. And how far it went kind of depended on the place. Some, or the vast majority of places, particularly in Europe, just carried the couple to the bedroom and then left, like deposited them on the bed and off they went. In others, it was a little bit more awkward as they actually stayed to watch the consummation, which, I mean, I can only imagine how weird that's be. Is, you know, you're newly married and suddenly you got your mother-in-law just watching you kind of get your business on. But yeah, but the whole idea as well, particularly with that, is it was the idea that the marriage weren't considered legitimate, or it could be annulled if the couple hadn't actually consummated it. You know, and so for royal weddings, or particularly nobility, the kind of bedding ceremony was actually a big deal because you have all the issues of succession and inheritance and stuff like that. So, yeah, and particularly remember as well, royal marriages as well very rarely are for love, particularly in this period. A lot of it is just to serve a greater political role. As they said, Prince Louis is married to an Austrian. And obviously, if you know anything about kind of European politics and stuff like that, Austria and France don't really have the best kind of record with each other. So this is kind of a big deal. But yeah, that's good start so far. Prince Louis is not doing
the
well.
Most prosperous, cultured, and beautiful nation in the world, as it had been for centuries. An exquisite social culture, with the king and the upper classes throwing crazy parties every night, enjoying high living and fine dining. Who cares that they were only able to do so off the backs of the hard-working, starving poor? What are they gonna do? Revolt? They're only 80% of the population. No. Life in France is great. What's that, France? You want to go to war with Britain and increase your power? Go for it, little buddy.
No.
You do you. And
Yeah, 7
you
years war.
lost. Now you're in severe financial debt. We have no money. What do we do?
Okay, so I just want to talk about this. So the 7 Years' War. The reason why I want to talk about this is because I feel like it hardly gets mentioned. And for me, and some other historians also agree, the 7 Years' War, though it's not called the First World War, is kind of the First World War, the first real World War, because it had fighting taking place in North America, South America, India, West Africa, as well as Europe. And I could go on for this for hours, but essentially, long story short, it resulted in like Britain, Prussia, and Portugal, and a number of smaller kind of Native American tribes in North America, and some smaller kind of German states like Hanover and things like this, versus practically the entire European continent. You know, so France, Austria, Russia, Spain, Sweden, in India, the Mughal Empire and stuff like that. And for Americans watching this, you might kind of know this period as the French-Indian War. That's where a certain little upstart lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington ambushed a French patrol, and kind of it spiraled from there a little bit. But yeah, so as the war progressed for, I think it raged for around 6 years, about 6.5 years, I think. Various different major powers, as I said, joined, you know, Sweden, Spain, Russia, all attempting to kind of make their own gains. But by the end of the war, Britain and Prussia were victorious, and Europe didn't actually change that very much. There was a status quo in the peace treaty. However, abroad, massive changes. France particularly lost huge amounts of their colonies. North America, practically everything kind of east of the Mississippi was handed over, along with Canada, which you saw there in the video there. The Mughal Empire practically collapsed. They had to give over Bengal to the British, which kind of led to the British getting that full control over the Indian subcontinent. So a massive war in that sense. And as I said, it was a major global conflict that France not only lost, but it bankrupted itself in the process, which, due to the financial issues involved in this, led to some very strange taxation deposits. And this only got worse when some certain rowdy colonials in the Americas started to rise up, the American Revolution, and the French, again, despite being bankrupted, decided to bankroll them and make their economic situation even worse. But I'm sure OverSimplified are gonna comment on that.
And you lost.
Yeah.
Now you're in severe financial debt. We have no money. What do we do? Should we stop partying? Heck no. Party harder. That's okay. The peasantry will pick up the slack.
Yep.
They were created by God to do all the work, and you were created to reap all the benefits and party hard. That's just how society works, and we've all just accepted it for centuries. Why? Why what? Why do the nobility get to be all rich and stuff? Just because they were born into it? And the rest of us schmucks just have to accept that? Hell, why do we even need a king? Who decided that? It all just seems very unfair and unequal, and I, for one, am starting to question it. Wow, that's very enlightened of you. And so began the Age of Enlightenment. Great philosophical thinkers across France and beyond began to question whether this beautiful nation was really all that beautiful after all. Hey, Prince Louis, bad news. Your grandpop died of smallpox this morning,
Right.
which means good news, you're now the king. So just to sum up, France is in severe financial debt, and the angry populace are beginning to question how necessary you are. But hey, I believe in you, champ. You got this. Maybe. Oh no!
Spoiler alert, he doesn't got this at all.
Prince Louis Capet became King Louis XVI in May 1774. He was a notoriously weak man, and he knew it. He barely had the wisdom to rule a nation, never mind one in crisis, and he was easily manipulated by those around him. One of his first acts was to try to get revenge on the British by financing their American colony's revolution. Hey, we're an independent nation now. That was real swell of you, Louis. Couldn't have done it without you. Glad I could help. So hey, about all that money we lent you, when can we get that back? Yep, you're a great guy. I'll never forget what you've done for us. Real glad I could help, friend, but about that money. Go now, chum. Best of luck to you. Oh, no.
Yep.
And now France was in even more debt. France is poor, suffering under the strain of economic ruin, watched as the nobility continued to live as though nothing was wrong. In particular, they grew increasingly disdainful of the Queen, Marie Antoinette, as she continued to spend all of France's money on her own luxurious lifestyle and fashion. While the peasants were breaking their backs in the fields, she was walking around like, hey, my hair is about it. I'm not making that up. Her hair
Wait.
really was about. And her lavish spending earned her the
Okay.
nickname Madame Deficit. And speaking of the Queen, there was also a long-standing scandal around the fact that the king took a very long time to boink her, and the working classes of Paris began ridiculing the royal couple with lewd pamphlets depicting the Queen as a court thought, and the king as a wuss, unable to fulfill his marital duty. Respect for the monarchy was at an all-time low, as France's finances were spiraling out of control, and the king and his aides really only had one solution to the crisis: tax the poor.
Yeah, which seems to be always the thing. But I just want to mention there as well about kind of the pamphlets and stuff about that, you know, making fun of both Marie Antoinette and King Louis here, is as well because it also draws a parallel to the Russian Revolution, if you remember, or if you've seen my video on OverSimplified's Russian Revolution, shameless plug, you can go and check that out. Before the kind of revolution took over, there was again a lot of kind of public pamphlets. There was a lot of kind of mocking materials about the Tsarina, Alexandria, and the whole idea that she was getting it off with Rasputin, and essentially, you know, Tsar Nicholas was a cuckold and all of this. So again, it's once kind of the respect of the monarchy starts to diminish, like considerably, then it's often kind of a predecessor, particularly if the monarchy aren't actually, well, doing anything good, which King Louis here with taxing the poor is not about to.
Tax the poor. We could do a sexy calendar shoot. Tax the poor. And so it was. The poor, who were already struggling to make ends meet, found themselves being taxed from every direction. Hey, I'm the royal tax collector. Looks like you've yet to pay your income tax, head tax. By the way, how many windows you got in that house of yours? 3? Oof. Yep, there's gonna be a tax for that. Hey, your local priest here, have you paid your church tithe yet? Well, at least this one is going to the good work of God. Sure. God. I think this year, God wants me to buy a new swimming pool. Hey, private tax collector here. Oh, and I brought some goons with me. Just a few quick questions. How much salt did you buy this year? About 7 kilos, I think? Yep, okay, there's gonna be a tax for that. Oh, what's that over there? And that's extra salt I held over from last year, so I wouldn't have to buy as much this year. Oh, yep, there's a tax for that. And what are you doing with all this salt? Well, obviously cooking. On the table. Yep, and preserving fish and meat. Oh no. Yep, and there's a tax for that. Hey, how old is he? He's 9. And so he's purchased his required amount of salt for this year, right? What? No, he's 9. Uh-oh. Sorry, little Timmy. Looks like I'm gonna have to tax you for that. salty. There's going to be a tax for that. And that's not all. A huge portion of the peasants' harvest had to be given up. And there was also the labor tax, where peasants were required to work a certain number of days for their local lord without pay.
Yeah, so this is mental when you think about this. And the irony here as well is France has literally just financed a revolution of the colonials in America, whose whole kind of the fuse that lit the revolution, so to speak, was the issue of taxation. And yet here you have French nobility piling useless tax. Well, to an extent as well. I know Britain's kind of taxation on the American colonials was, you know, is debatable, but at least a lot of those tax levies actually made a degree of sense. A lot of these here that they're implying on the French people themselves, their own people, you know, just utterly insane. And the fact that, you know, you not only have tax collectors, but you have tax collectors who are essentially going around with an armed bodyguard, an armed escort, you know, thuggery basically, to essentially steal, because at this point it's more or less stealing from already some of the poorest people in society, which, you know, again, what were they thinking? They've just seen it happen in America. They helped the Americans do this, and yet they're doing the exact same thing here, but arguably, in my opinion, a lot worse, because things like the labour tax is ridiculous. You know, the working days without pay, you know, giving up their harvest and things like this. And, you know, as history has shown, the masses can tolerate a lot, but eventually they hit a wall. You know, and the poorest can put up with taxation, but eventually they're going to snap at some point. And all you need is that breaking point. And it's just quite ironic that the French, in their support of the American Revolution, are completely somewhat oblivious to their own contribution to what would become the French Revolution. They're completely and utterly oblivious to that fact, and it's just... yeah.
Obviously, people weren't too happy with these taxation policies, and the aggressive nature of these private tax farmers sometimes even escalated to violence. In particular, though, the people really hated how inconsistent the taxation rules were across the nation, and also the fact that the first two estates often had to pay very little, if any tax at all.
Hardly any.
So, the anger continued to grow. France had a population that was just about ready to explode. What could push them over the edge? How about a touch of natural disaster? A series of harsh summers and winters left the peasants' harvests in ruin, meaning they had no food or money, and the cost of bread skyrocketed. Of course, the upper classes had massive stocks of grain and wheat, so they were virtually untouched by this new crisis. But now the poor really were starving, and they began to riot. Women took to the streets, bakeries were raided, and bakers suspected of keeping bread for themselves were sometimes even hanged. Wow, this is really getting out of control. Your Majesty, we need some decisive action. You need to step up and lead us. What will you do? Okay, I've got this. I know. I'll summon the Estates General, and they'll decide what to do.
Yeah, so, as I said, King Louis at this point, is doomed himself with his own inaction. France is in crisis, and rather than actually make a decision, he defers to the Estates General, which I assume we're about to get into, so I'll leave it for now. But a bit like what I was saying earlier, with the common people will put up with so much. And as I said, in this case, taxation, that can be tolerated. They're not happy about it, but people can tolerate that. But starvation is a huge motivator. And so when you have people who are taxed, when you have people who don't have food, that anger of taxation is going to boil out into desperation, because you have the poorest in society who are being taxed out of their minds. They can't feed their families and stuff like this. And now at that point, what have the common people got to lose? You know, and again, food, massive motivator. I mean, again, to draw a parallel to the Russian Revolution, for those of you who know Russian history, one of the main slogans of the Bolsheviks was peace, bread, land. You know, peace from the First World War, land for the peasantry, and bread. You know, it is such a simple premise, but the whole idea of, you know, the common people generally, you know, I feel like we get enamored with this whole idea of, you know, liberty and, you know, democracy and these good ideological virtues, but I feel like the general everyday person, particularly those at the lowest run of society, just want to get by. And, you know, food is one of the things that you can't take away from them without causing major issues. And that's why, as you see in history, not just with the French Revolution, not just with the Russian Revolution, but in practically all countries where there's been social unrest, the moment that food becomes an issue is when things really start to heat up. But let's get to the Estates General, because that is utterly insane as well, if you don't know.
You really are a fat, ill-bred boy. The Estates General was the closest thing France had to a government, apart from the king. It was a purely advisory body and was rarely summoned. In fact, it hadn't been summoned for 175 years prior to this. But with France in a severe crisis, the king felt the time was right to call on the government to help. The Estates General was made up of representatives from the three estates, that is, the clergy, the nobility, and everybody else. Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. The first order of business is regarding the clergy and nobility. You all get brand new Porsches. You get a Porsche, and you get a Porsche, and you get a Porsche. Everybody gets a Porsche. And now into the second order of business. France is completely out of money. Like, it's never been this bad before. Anyone got any ideas? How about we all get Lamborghinis next time? The king decided that in order to make a decision, they had to come up with a voting system. Okay, the clergy. You have a population of 130,000, so you'll get one vote. The nobility. You have a population of 350,000, so you'll also get one vote. And the third estate. You have a population of 27 million people and make up 98% of the population. Very impressive. You'll get
one vote.
One vote. The third estate were obviously pretty unhappy with this system because they kept on finding that this would happen. We propose to raise taxes on the third estate. All in favor? All opposed? 2-1. Taxes will be raised on the third estate. We propose a motion that says the first two estates are a bunch of poo-poo heads. All in favor? All opposed? 2-1. It's official. We are not poo-poo heads.
Yeah, so the Estates General is a useless institute, because in theory, the idea that a king that holds absolute power but can defer to his advisors isn't necessarily a bad idea in practice, or in theory rather, not practice. In practice, is very bad, because for the reason is King Louis has the kind of backbone of a jellyfish. He can't make a decision, and so when your king is as kind of spineless or as indecisive as King Louis was, the Estates General is kind of as useful as a chocolate teapot. The idea that 98% of the population as well only gets one vote, yeah, I mean, that's mental. I mean, in my own country, there's a big debate between proportional representation and first past the post system, you know, in those different kind of voting methods for elections and stuff like this. It gets quite heated and things like this. But there's always reasons to be thankful, because at least we're not running this type of situation. But as we're about to see, the third estate, you know, the 98% of the population, aren't too keen on this, and, you know, they maybe start to think that they hold the cards, actually, and then they try to do something about it, but that's jumping ahead. Let's get back to the video.
The third estate realized that any attempt at reform would be outvoted by the two upper estates, and they thought that was kind of lame.
Yeah.
So they decided that since they were 98% of the population, they could go off to form their own government, make their own laws, and take over the running of the country. And so, the National Assembly was born. The third estate was now in control, and there was nothing the king could do to stop. Haha! I've locked you all out of your building. What are you gonna do about it? We'll probably go find a different building that isn't locked. Ow, no. The National Assembly did find another unlocked building just down the road, an indoor tennis court. Where on the 20th of June 1789, they all took the tennis court oath, pledging to continue meeting until the king finally gave in to their demands for more equality and economic reform. This new National Assembly included many of the most educated members of the Third Estate, including two young lawyers by the names of Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton. Some members of the first two estates even joined their cause. Some of these men formed a radical new political party called the Jacobin Club and quickly became leading figures. While many members of the Third Estate simply wanted more equality, a growing number in this Jacobin faction would begin calling for something even crazier, the removal of the king entirely.
Yeah.
And this is where fear began to take hold. With such a volatile situation developing, everyone was afraid of something. The king feared his position was under threat, and he called in the military to take position around Paris. The Third Estate heard rumor of the gathering military force, and they feared the king was planning to round them up and arrest them. Maybe he'd even execute them. It also didn't help that the king had just dismissed France's popular finance minister, who had been trying to make reforms himself. It seemed the king was done negotiating. Fear, left unchecked, often boils over into anger, and anger detonates with violence. The angry people of Paris, after centuries of cruel inequality, harsh oppression, even starvation, fearful of having their new movement for reform demolished so soon, decided that it was now or never to take action.
Yeah, and I hate to do this, to quote a certain little green fella called Yoda, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And that's a plot history of the French Revolution for you, essentially, is you have the National Assembly get set up, and I suppose if you wanted to compare it again with another Russian Revolution analogy, it's kind of similar to the Soviets in a way, that it's different, but it's essentially a platform of the people taking power or making decisions away from the actual government. So that's probably the best kind of comparable thing that I can think of to compare it to, even though the makeup was completely different. But the thing is, as well, while it was a kind of good idea in practice and it had this really good thing, the problem with the National Assembly is, and generally the wider French Revolution as a whole, I suppose, is many people within the National Assembly didn't have experience. They didn't have experience in leading, in administrating, in organising, just general kind of state level experience. And you know, as a result, it kind of led to what was something that was supposed to be like good intentioned reforming work, kind of deferred into this kind of chaotic mess that we know it as, and particularly with the Reign of Terror, which I imagine is probably going to be part 2, given how long's left in this video, with Robespierre, as he was mentioned there. You know, it went down the kind of dark path that the French Revolution is remembered for, kind of modern day now. And so, yeah, you know, everyone's afraid, and fear, again, like I said, food, starvation is a huge motivator, but fear is. You make people scared, you then have a situation where things can boil over very, very quickly. And again, the government's use of military to do things just kind of exacerbates things even more. I'm trying to think of when in history that a government has called upon the military to kind of try and quell or calm down kind of public sentiment, and it hasn't ended in disaster free for the government or the citizens. Very rarely does a good outcome come of that.
Screw reform. They decided they'd do one better. How about revolution? The people of Paris, believing the French military was preparing to attack, decided they should arm themselves. The National Assembly announced the creation of a bourgeois militia, the National Guard, and immediately many troops from the French military defected over to the revolutionary side. In the early hours of July 14th, 1789, a large crowd stormed and raided the Hôtel des Invalides, a military hospital where they were able to secure a large number of rifles. The bad news was they weren't able to find any gunpowder for their new weapons. The good news was they knew exactly where to get some. A prison fortress and a symbol of royal tyranny towering over Paris, the Bastille. Mid-morning, the crowd gathered around the Bastille and demanded that the man in charge, Governor Delaunay, surrender the prison and hand over the gunpowder. Obviously, Governor Delaunay was like, no way. So he stalled for time by inviting a few members of the crowd in for negotiations. The crowd, still waiting outside, quickly became impatient, and before long, they stormed the fortress, taking on the French troops inside. Your Majesty, we've received word that the people have surrounded the Bastille. Governor Delaunay will hold them off. No need to worry. Actually, Your Majesty, it appears the crowd is now headed away from the Bastille. You see? What did I tell you? Clearly, Governor Delaunay has defeated them and has them on the run. No need to worry. Your Majesty, isn't that Governor Delaunay's head on a pike? Well, clearly, Governor Delaunay has taken on the form of a bodiless pike-head deity, and the people are so enamored with him, they're parading him around the city. No need to worry at all. When the National Assembly heard about the violence that had taken place, they had two options. Either one, they denounce it and try to carry on the revolution using peaceful means, or two, they say, damn, you stuck his head on a pike? That's pretty hardcore. And we love it. Incidentally, they went with option number 2. Some historians believe this reaction paved the way for the utter violence and bloodshed that would become the legacy of the French Revolution. This widespread acceptance of violence during the revolution is also largely credited to the writings of a certain Jean-Paul Marat, a man of science with a horrible skin condition that kept him confined to a bathtub. He began writing a radical newspaper he affectionately named The Friend of the People. Citizens of France, be very afraid. Given the chance, the king and the nobility won't hesitate to massacre us all. The solution is simple. Execute them. Kill every last one of them. Cut off 1,000 heads, and if that's not enough, cut off 1,000 more. Oh, hey, Mr. Squeaky. What are you doing down there? You're so cute. Aw, I love you too, Mr. Squeaky. Mwah. Now, where was I? Oh, yeah. Kill them all. It became one of the most popular publications in Paris during the revolution and succeeded in spreading ever-increasing fear and anger among the people. In August, leaders of the National Assembly, with help from a certain Thomas Jefferson, adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, an incredible document that guaranteed liberty and equal rights to all men. And when I say men, I mean men.
Not men.
Despite its glaring shortcomings in gender equality, the massively influential declaration would go on to inspire the struggle for liberty and equality across the planet for centuries. However, back in France, the vast majority of the people weren't really so concerned with enlightened ideas of equality as much as they were concerned with the fact that they were still starving. Bread was still expensive as hell and hard to come by. The people felt that one reason nothing had been done yet about the crisis was because the king simply couldn't see the problem. He lived in Versailles, a full 20 kilometers southwest of Paris, and as a result, lived in comfort, separated from his dirty, stinking subjects. On October 5th, a crowd of women, 7,000 strong, decided they'd do something unprecedented. They decided they'd remove that separation and confront the king directly. The women marched all the way to the king's palace in Versailles. Along the way, the crowd continued to grow into the tens of thousands, and when they arrived, they demanded an audience with the king. What are those things outside the palace? They're poor people, Your Majesty. That's poor people? They say they're hungry. Hungry? Then let them eat cake. Wow. See, this is the exact BS that led to this whole mess in the first place. You're so out of touch. They're writhing around in the filth, breaking their back to barely scrape by, and they come to you demanding just the basic ability to feed themselves, and you think a slice of cake will sort them out? Well, then let them eat Taco Bell Crunchwrap Supreme. Wow. They're not that desperate. Members of the crowd actually managed to break into the palace with the intention of killing the queen, who narrowly escaped through a secret passage in her bedroom. The enraged mob killed several members of the royal guard and raised their heads on pikes, which, if you haven't noticed yet, is something they were quite fond of doing. The king had no choice but to come out and talk to the crowd. He agreed to accept his new position, sharing power with the revolutionary government, and to return to Paris with the crowd, removing the separation between king and subject. King Louis had a problem with people constantly raiding his palace, but one thing he didn't have a problem with was people raiding his computer, because he used NordVPN.
Okay. I think that's, okay. So that's the end of the video there. But yeah, so I think the quote at the end there with Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, is something that didn't actually happen, but it's more attributed to her as kind of an analogy to show how disconnected her, the royalty, and the nobility were to the kind of struggles of the everyday person. But yeah, as they said, the problem with the violence is, well, it would cause problems not only for France, but abroad as well. Obviously you have the Napoleonic Wars and stuff like that, but just the perception of violence in the French Revolution. Because again, the National Assembly, they had the choice between condemning the violence or kind of reveling in it. And the problem is, as I said, the French kind of aristocracy and the royalty and the government has kind of made the rod for her own back, because the Third Estate has tried peaceful methods and they've been shouted down for it. So once peace fails, then the only thing that they have left is violence. And that would kind of be the hallmark for the French Revolution. But abroad, particularly in my own country of Britain, I don't necessarily know how it was in wider Europe, but particularly in Britain, there would be a split kind of between those who were sympathetic to the revolution. These would be, your people like Thomas Paine, who ironically actually had to flee to France after his second volume of The Rights of Man, where he advocated for republicanism, and by doing that, he got condemned for seditious libel by royal proclamation and had to flee to France. But those other who were sympathetic to the kind of revolution, the cause of what they were doing, also kind of set up societies and things like this that sought to bring about peaceful political reform in that manner. So, that's something that kind of happened there, but there was also people who were very much anti-revolution. And for that, the violence that was happening in the French Revolution just stoked their fires of how much they kind of opposed that. This would only get worse kind of again in the early 1790s. I think it was 1792 when the first French Republic was proclaimed. And as part of that proclamation, they basically said that they would promise armed support for all kind of subjected peoples around the world. So essentially the idea of, kind of spreading this kind of global revolution. And essentially just promising like proxy wars and trying to cause destabilization. But the promise of armed support for population, basically trying to incite kind of similar kind of revolutions or rebellions and stuff like this, just drove the anti-revolutionary sentiment even more in favor of those nations bordering France, particularly Britain. But this video has probably actually gone on long enough, however. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope that I've helped you learn something. I hope OverSimplified has helped you learn something. And I hope you will join me as we check out part 2 of the French Revolution by OverSimplified, because I'm about to get straight onto that. So that'll be up tomorrow. And thank you. Bye-bye.